Economic inequality in Israel is on the rise, which means the gap between the rich and the poor there is ever so distant. For the regime in Israel, it is the social disparities more than poverty that are worrying because they are a source of social instability. A large part of the inequality in Israel comes from the top 1% of the population alone. That top tier is cut off from the other 99% of Israelis. In fact, the gap is so big that if the 1% of Israeli society was excluded from the total economic equation, inequality is less severe, but still considerable wealth inequality will continue to exist. The underlying factors behind the rise in inequality is poverty, rising living costs, population growth, growing unemployment, and low wages. According to a report by the National Economic Council, Israel ranks just behind the US in largest income inequality rate in the world. The report for the most part cites economic issues that have been neglected for years as the main problem for Israel's rise in economic inequality. Recently, the economy in Israel isn't doing so great. Teva, a company in Israel, cut 14,000 jobs worldwide, including 1,700 in Israel. The issue received such public outrage that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had to address the issue.
השבוע אני אפגש יחד עם שר האוצר ושר הכלכלה עם מנכ"ל טבע. אני קיימתי איתו שיחה בשבוע שעבר, ואמרתי לו שהיעד הראשון שלנו הוא קודם כל למזער את הפגיעה בעובדים, זה דבר ראשון. דבר השני הוא כמובן לעשות ככל שניתן, למנוע סגירה של מפעל או מפעלים בירושלים. והדבר השלישי הוא להבטיח שטבע תישאר במדינת ישראל, יש בה אלפי עובדים, ואנחנו קמה כחברה ישראלית, אנחנו רוצים שהיא תישאר כחברה ישראלית.
Many Israelis, however, blame corrupt policies by the regime in Tel Aviv for the economic inequalities. A recent gas deal between the Israeli regime and U.S. energy consortiums triggered protests in Tel Aviv.
To say that the people of Israel are against the current policy of the Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu government, we think that the natural resources of Israel belong to the people and not for the rich people.
I believe that unfortunately the oligarchs, that they are pigs, the signs say rule of the pigs, meaning that the oligarchs are trying to get the natural resources of the world, and in Israel it's the same.
In another instance, back in April of 2018, Netanyahu's regime put forth a new law that would limit the powers of Israel's Supreme Court to go after shadowy behind-doors deals that enrich the rich and possibly even regime officials. The issue triggered demonstrations by Israelis who chanted slogans against Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as they held banners and marched down.
מעבר לסיסמאות שאומרים ביבי תוריד את הידיים שלך מבגץ, שזה המכשול האחרון, כמו שאומרים, ששם יכול להיעצר ויכול גם לעבור החוקים והרגולציות השונות והמשונות מאוד שהראש ממשלה שלי מנסה להפוך את המדינה הזאת למדינת נתניהו.
אוקיי, אני מגיעה להפגין כל שבוע, היום אני מוטרדת במיוחד. אנחנו מדברים על פסקה שאמורה להיות עוד מעט מיושמת, שנקראת פסקת ההתגברות, שבה בעצם בג"ץ לא יוכל להגיד לגוף המחוקק שהחוק איננו חוקתי. אני גם מודאגת בכלל
Inequality affecting the bottom 40% of all income earners was the main factor bringing down overall economic growth. As inequality rises in Israel, families with lower-level socioeconomic backgrounds experience significant falls in educational attainment and skills, implying large amounts of wasted potential and lower social mobility, according to the OECD, or the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. In addition, housing prices have risen 114% since 2007, and rents rose by 50%, while food prices have increased by 26% in the same time period.
That the majority of the settlers actually in the West Bank are not there for ideological reasons as much as they are there for financial reasons. They can get a better standard of living for the same price, and especially when the prices are shooting way up in the center, like in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. These are very expensive cities. So people find themselves migrating to the occupied territories, to the West Bank, for example, becoming settlers. They don't care about living there at the expense of the others, the Palestinians, but they do so, many of them do so not necessarily because of the ideology as much as because they are just seeking a better standard of living.
The growing disparities between the rich and the poor is hurting most Israelis. A report by the Chesdi Nomi, an Israeli anti-poverty NGO, has found that 60% of Israelis said they would prefer a Western European country, such as Germany, Switzerland, or Holland, as the place they would choose to retire in instead of Israel. Another study by the Top Center for Social Policy Studies noted that the average Israeli worker has no more buying power than a decade and a half ago, despite producing 15% more.